All right, we are live. Good evening and welcome to Method Ministries. We are back. Super excited. We have Dr. Richard Weikart back. If you watched the first video that we just released, we did a talk on Hitler and what he believed about Christianity, God, and Jesus. That was a great one. Go watch that video. And we talked about his awesome book, Hitler's Religion, that I highly recommend. And I was telling Dr. Weikart, this is the perfect timing that we got in touch because today we're going to talk about Darryl Cooper's President's podcast discussion with Tucker Carlson and really surrounding things that are just incorrect and false. And so I'm not an expert on this, but luckily Dr. Richard Weikart is. So that's why he's here. And he's going to talk about some of these problems and also get into more of the Nazi, ideology and what they believe to show how this revisionism that's happening and kind of having a resurgence is wrong. So, Doctor, thank you so much for being here and welcome back.
Yeah, it's great to be with you.
Absolutely. So you want to give like your initial thoughts to the talk with Tucker Carlson that Cooper gave?
Yeah, well, first of all, there were some points that the Cooper, of course, has that are right, and that's normally the case when someone has things so badly wrong. That they do have some things that are right. So let me start off with the things that I think he is right. I mean, I think he's right that Chamberlain and the British during World War II did not do everything uh, in a morally upright way in the way that they conducted the war. He points out that they killed civilians in their bombing campaigns and the kinds of things like that. And I think that is immoral, and I don't think that was justified. You could give lots of different examples, and so Cooper focuses on these kinds of issues about Churchill and the way that he waged the war. And most of the, by the way, the discussion about the World War II was about Churchill. He's focusing mostly on Churchill.
Oh, I think the Wi-Fi maybe have some streaming capability problems. Hopefully, it's not
Chamberlain
too bad.
always in a negative light for doing things most obviously were more civilians in the war. Yes, the British did do that. Don't do that. He's not among others. But when Cooper turns to talk about Hitler, which he does briefly, he doesn't talk about Hitler very extensively, but in that particular interview where he talks about Hitler, he says that he doesn't think Hitler was a good guy anyway. Then what his only criticism that he raises, at least at that particular interview, was that when Hitler went into the East with his invasion in 1941, he said that they didn't have any plans of what to do with all the Soviet POWs. And so those prisoners were left to die of starvation, or they were shot out of, quote, mercy. He portrays it as being a merciful act because they didn't have the logistics to care for these Soviet POWs. And in this, Cooper shows a complete and total lack of understanding of Hitler and the Nazi mentality and what they were about in World War II. And what's interesting too, and if you think about and when he talks about the relationship, getting back to the issue of Churchill, when he talks about Hitler and Churchill, he points out that Hitler, after conquering Poland and France and Denmark and Norway and the Netherlands, offered the British a peace deal. And Cooper seems to think that Churchill should have taken it. Churchill should have, gone ahead and gone along with that. And he criticizes Churchill very sharply for continuing the war. By the way, Cooper never mentions that Chamberlain was not, that Churchill was not the one to declare war on Hitler either. Chamberlain actually declared war on Hitler. Churchill wasn't in power until May 1940, after the war was already underway. But Hitler did offer a peace deal to Churchill in the summer of 1940 after conquering France, and Churchill rejected. And Cooper slams Churchill for rejecting that deal. Well, there's several problems with that criticism of Churchill. For one thing, Hitler never kept any of his other agreements before that time, claiming that he would be at peace. So when he took over the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia at the Munich conference in late 1938, he said, "Oh, I will never go into. I'll leave the rest of Czechoslovakia free, and I won't go into that. I will guarantee their territories." Then what does he do 6 months later? He attacks Czechoslovakia. Okay. Then he also had a 10-year in a non-aggression pact with Poland that was in place, but he violated that, and he went ahead and attacked Poland in September 1st, 1939. And then later on, of course, in 1941, he was going to attack the Soviet Union, despite the fact that he had a non-aggression pact with Stalin that he'd set up just before he attacked Poland. He and Stalin had set up this deal, the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. And so Cooper is incredibly naive to think that Churchill should have trusted Hitler. Hitler was not trustworthy, but Cooper seems to think that, you know, Churchill should have just given in, signed a peace agreement with Hitler, and that Hitler would have been fine with it. Now, interestingly, I do actually agree with Cooper that Hitler probably would have left Britain alone, at least for a long time, because he was more interested in moving against the Soviets and moving toward the East. And so he probably would have been, his hands would have been tied if he'd signed a peace, if Churchill had signed a peace agreement with Hitler in the summer of 1940, let's say. Hitler probably would have still turned his attention to the East, just as he did ultimately in 1941. Probably would have given Britain a lot more reprieve and such from the war. But to think that Hitler would keep his word is just absurd. And to think that Churchill getting out of the war would have somehow made things better in the long run is, to me, really naive.
We might be getting some Wi-Fi little troubles. Just bear with us. I don't know if I'm coming over clear to you.
Now you are, yeah. There were a few places where it cut out, I think, but yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I just want to touch on that too, because there's this thing going around where, oh, everybody needs to read this one book by Pat Buchanan, I believe it is the last name. No, I didn't read the book, but this idea keeps on circulating that if Churchill just gave Hitler what he wanted, we never would have been involved in this war. And I'm thinking, so let me get this straight. If Hitler just kept stealing land, eugenics, genocide, if Churchill was just nice enough, just leave him alone, let him do this, Hitler would never, this World War II never would have happened. It's like, are you really hearing yourself over here? So we're just supposed to concede, capitulate, let Hitler do. And by the way, Churchill, he did do that. Like, it wasn't just like, you do one thing, 1 inch, move, to this, way and direction, and that's it. We're all going to war, and I don't care. There was many capitulations that they gave to them. So it was not just an overnight, turn the switch and that's it. Let's all go to war with them. And it's just recasting the narrative. They're trying to move some pieces around, place some doubt on the board, and they're trying to act like, what I told you too, that, oh, I'm just finally being objective here. Like I'm finally, we're finally able to just look at this objectively. Like nobody has done this before. Like nobody has just looking objectively at World War II. Like, you've been doing this literally before I was born. And it's just absurd. And this is premise going on that, oh, we're the objective ones, and we're gonna give them the truth and be strong enough to parade the truth, and look at us, we're the real masculine men. And then people who disagree, what do? They call them boomers. I don't know if you heard that term, but people like you and even me, if I fit into this category, I'm called a boomer, and I'm just holding to this idolatry or this idol worship of post-war consensus. And so there's a ton of rhetoric going on with this, and so it's not just revisionism. Like this revisionism is one piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, and it's ignoring a lot of evidence is the big problem with it. I mean, it again, there's certain things where Cooper and others, bring out things about, things that Churchill did wrong, that the Allies, were not always morally upright in the way that they carried out the war. That's definitely true. But if you take that and you look at the way that Hitler carried on the war, it's a difference between night and day, even though, the night may not be totally, excuse me, the day, say with the, if you want to call the Allies' day, may not be totally bright, but if you look at the Hitler and the night, it's pretty bleak and pretty dark, because Hitler, when he was waging war, was not just trying to rectify what had happened in World War I. And that's sometimes how some of these people try to cast this. Oh, Hitler was just trying to get back what Germany had lost during the World War I. Germany was aggrieved because of the Versailles Treaty after World War I. And certainly Hitler did play upon that that element of the Versailles Treaty and their, and Germany being aggrieved. But that was not Hitler's ultimate goal. And when you study Hitler's ideology, which I've done very extensively, I've published a book called Hitler's Ethic, The Nazi Pursuit of Evolutionary Progress, where I detail which also deals with a lot of those similar issues as well, where I show that, and by the way, this is pretty well established by lots of different historians too. This is not just my quirky take on it or something like that, that Hitler had this social Darwinist mindset, which believed that populations, and here we're talking about races, because that's Hitler thought everything was about race, everything centered around race. He thought that populations tended to reproduce faster than their food supply. This is exactly what Malthus had taught, that Darwin had taken over and that then social Darwinists had taken on. So populations expand faster than their food supply. And so Hitler believed that because of that, this leads to this struggle for existence between races. And the way to win that struggle for existence between races, Hitler believed, was to gain what he called living space. Living space was a specific term that was used before Hitler's time by a guy named Friedrich Ratzel, who was a Darwinian biologist who became a geographer. And Ratzel argued forthrightly that the Darwinian struggle for existence among humans was a struggle for space, a struggle for land. And Hitler took over that idea, and Hitler talked constantly about living space, including when he was talking to his generals about why they were fighting the war in the first place on the Eastern. Idea was that war is about living space, and you're not just you're not trying to take over a population and quote Germanize them. In fact, Hitler actually speaks to this to his generals. He said, we can't go into a territory like Poland or the Soviet Union and try to Germanize the population. Rather, Hitler said, we need to Germanize the land. And the way to do that, you have to push off these so-called inferior races, the Slavs, and Hitler did clearly think the Slavs were inferior races. There actually was a book that the SS published during the war called Der Untermensch, which literally means the subhuman. And that book about the subhuman, on its cover, is not talking. It has a photo. It has a picture not of Jews. They did think the Jews were subhuman too, but this particular pamphlet is not talking primarily about Jews. It's talking about Slavs, and the cover photo of it has these Soviet POWs on it called the subhuman. So the propaganda was that these Slavs are subhuman. We need to get rid of them off their land one way or another. It could be through forced emigration, forcing them to leave their land and go east of the Urals, for example. That was one kind of plan that was put forward. Or it could be through annihilation, either in war or during peacetime. But Hitler believed that those populations needed to be, quote, cleansed. They needed to be gotten rid of so that he could take over those territories and so that he could expand the German population in those territories. And the Germans actually drew up a plan called Generalplan Ost, the General Plan East, in which they specifically decided that they were going to clear out certain areas. They were going to clear out this corridor of Slavs from a corridor going from Germany through Poland into the Black Sea region. That was going to sort of be the beachhead where they were going to then expand from that area into the rest of the Soviet Union. So clearly Hitler's whole mentality was genocidal from the very word go. I mean, he made this clear when he talked to his generals. He didn't make it clear publicly usually because he's trying to, cater to the masses and he's presenting himself as a man of peace, of course, in the 1933 to 37 and 38. Because he wants to keep the French and the British off his back. He kept saying, I'm a man of peace. I'm not going to fight a war, blah, blah, blah. Behind the scenes, he was talking to his generals and others saying, we got to prepare for war because we're going to go to war. And here's why we're going to go to war. So, Hitler was talking out of both sides of his mouth, depending on whether he was talking publicly and whether the British and French had access to what he was talking about, or whether he was talking to his generals and talking to Nazi cadres and things like that. So it was very clear that Hitler, through his own mentality and worldview, was intending to practice genocide. That was just part of his whole worldview, that the way he thought things had to be. There was this racial struggle for existence that he was wanting to win. And the way to win it was to fight warfare and to kick other people out of those territories as you're able to do that. And so one of the things, once Hitler took over territories, let's think about like Czechoslovakia.
Yeah.
Okay, Hitler took over Czechoslovakia in 1939, and he set up he the Sudetenland regions with the Germans they annexed, but most of the rest of it was set up into a system where the Germans were ruling over it with a governor over the rest of especially the western parts of Czechoslovakia. And one of the things that the Nazis did during that period is they tried to practice what they called racial sifting. Now, they did this not only
Mm.
in Czechoslovakia, they did it in Poland, they did it elsewhere too. Racial sifting meant they tried to identify who in that Czech population had a Nordic racial identity
Mm.
and who did not. And because actually the Germans thought that among the Czechs, they thought about 50% of them were Nordic. And so they wanted to try to find who the Czechs are Nordic, who's not. And the idea was once they've identified those two elements of the population, ultimately they're going to try to drive out the non-Nordic elements of the population and take over and allow the Nordic ones to survive as long as they would cooperate. That is with the Germans. You know, if the Czechs were forming resistance and things like that, even if they're Nordic, you know, they're going to get killed. But if the Czechs are Nordic and they're willing to cooperate with the Nazis, they can survive. If the Czechs are non-Nordic, they're Slavic, and they're not, and then it doesn't matter what their position is. They're going to be pushed out of those regions. And so the Nazis actually set up X-ray. They set up teams that
Mm.
were going in there, X-ray teams, to try to go in and theoretically they were trying to sift for other kinds of diseases, but the reality was they were trying to identify what race. They had anthropologists and physicians who were supposed to identify the race of these people to try to do that. Now, of course, the Nazi didn't control the territory long enough to put all these plans into operation. They didn't actually get around to actually expelling lots of Czechs during the period because they lost the war too quickly and they weren't able to identify all the elements of the population in that amount of time. They did do some similar things in Poland where they had Germans who came from the Baltic states. Stalin allowed some Germans from the Baltic states to come to the German Reich, the larger German Reich, including occupied Poland. And some of them were allowed to take over territories in Poland, and they pushed Poles out of those territories to allow the Germans to take over. So the whole idea of Hitler's warfare was genocide. It was to push peoples out of those territories either by killing or by forcing them to emigrate from those areas to take over those for the German populations.
Well, so let's just go back to Hitler moving, because it seems like Hitler, as you said, he didn't want a war with the West. He just kind of wanted to go move east. Definitely the communists. But is it accurate to say that there was the reason why he was doing this because he felt like one, or maybe he was just using this as an excuse. I mean, probably is that he was saying there's Germans in there. We have to save them from persecution or oppression, and the Jews were like the enemies again. Like, is that the accurate approach to finding a motive? Like why was Hitler moving east, and why did he, and what was the justification for this?
Yeah, well, actually, there were several justifications. One of them was because the Soviet Union was communist, and Hitler hated communism, and so he wanted to destroy communism. By the way, Hitler thought communism was Jewish. He equated the two things. He said
Yes.
Jews and communism are identical, although actually he blamed the Jews for capitalism too. The Jews were responsible for both capitalism and for
Of
communism,
course,
both at the same
naturally.
time. But he blamed the Jews for communism, and so communism was one key reason that he wanted to destroy the Soviet Union. He wanted to destroy communism. So that's one element of it. But probably a bigger element of it was that the Soviet Union had lots of agricultural territory. And in his push for living space that I mentioned earlier, he wanted agricultural territory. He didn't want to take over territories that had large population, or unless he was going to push those populations out, of course, too. But so he wanted territories with agriculture so the Germans could go in and take over these agricultural territories. So he thought that there was lots of food supply there, and that food supply then would be able to feed the burgeoning German population that he wanted to expand even to a larger extent. A third key racially to Western Europeans. The France had been populated in part by the Franks, which were a Germanic tribe. And similarly in Britain, the Anglo-Saxons were Germanic tribes also that settled Britain. So he thought that the British and the French had more Nordic blood in them. He thought that when I use the word Nordic, Nordic and Aryan, by the way, were synonyms.
Mm.
But so they had more Aryan or Nordic blood in them, and thus he thought it would be easier to conquer the Slavs in the East. And also he thought, since they were so much more racially inferior, it was more justifiable to, eliminate them from the globe. He actually thought the British had enough Nordic blood in them that he thought might be able to cooperate with them in his early going, but of course they were unwilling to do that, and so that didn't work out.
So yeah, it sounds like let's say Churchill never intervened, quote unquote, even though it wasn't him who was the one that declared war. Hitler would just eventually just keep on moving and moving and moving until eventually he just conquers and takes over all of Russia, and that would have just do you think like that would have been content enough for him, or would he just wanted more? Like, where do you think if we never went to war with him, where do you think that all this would have ended?
Well, part of the problem here is that, a lot of this is based on conjecture because we don't know what would have happened. Okay, if Britain had stayed out, or if Churchill had cut a peace with uh, Germany the way that Cooper seems to think he should have in the summer of 1940. By the way, at that point, Hitler already controlled France, Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Norway. So he already didn't just control. He wasn't just pushing to the east. Or Churchill would have had an opportunity to cut a peace treaty. Now, Chamberlain, of course, if he had not declared war, and there's some people in the past who have said that, well, Chamberlain should have declared war on Hitler in September 1939. But let's go back. Chamberlain had not declared war on Hitler. Then Hitler would have taken over Poland without a war against France. He probably would not have moved against France, Belgium, Netherlands, maybe not against Denmark, Norway, and wouldn't have attacked Britain, wouldn't have been in war with Britain. He probably would have prepared for war ultimately with the Soviet Union, and probably ultimately would have attacked them like he ultimately did in the summer of 1941. Now, when he would have done it, who knows? Hitler didn't have a timetable or exact plan as to when he was going to do all of these different things. And by the way, Hitler probably was surprised that the British and French declared war on him. I think he actually expected that they were going to back off just like they had done the last several times. They'd already backed off at the Munich conference and handed over the Sudetenland to Czechoslovakia. They'd backed off after he'd attacked Czechoslovakia in March 1939 and took over Czechoslovakia. Britain and France did not do anything at that point. I think Hitler was expecting a similar kind of thing with Poland, that Britain and France would stay out of it. And once he took over Poland, he actually did offer peace feelers to Britain and France while still preparing for war against them. So the conjecture, okay, what would have happened if Hitler had attacked the Soviet Union but wouldn't have been at war with Britain? Well, Hitler would have actually had a little stronger position. Maybe he could have won. I doubt it. My guess is he probably still would have lost against the Soviet Union, just like he did anyway, just like he did in the
Oh,
long run
really?
anyway. The Soviet Union just had massive resources, way beyond what Hitler had at his disposal, and the land is just so massive too. I mean, just like Napoleon thought he was going to, go in and take over Russia, and actually Napoleon did conquer Moscow. Unlike Hitler, Hitler wasn't able to take Moscow. Napoleon took over Moscow, but it still didn't help him. He still ended up losing the war to Russia because burned the city of Moscow down. He placed troops. Winter was set in for Napoleon. He had to retreat. Well, Hitler, I think, probably would have also ultimately been defeated by the Soviet Union. So then likely what would have happened was the Soviet Union would have had an even stronger position in the world if they were able to defeat Germany ultimately. It probably would have taken them longer. It would have taken longer for the Soviet Union to defeat Germany without British and American help. But ultimately, I think the Soviet Union probably would have still prevailed. So Britain might have spared itself some destruction in the war, possibly. But it's unclear. He probably wouldn't have stopped Hitler from trying to launch his war against the Soviet Union. Probably wouldn't have stopped the Holocaust because that was taking place in the East. Primarily, might have saved some Jews in France and Denmark and Norway, but that would have been a small percentage of the Jews. Hitler might have even killed more Jews if Churchill hadn't intervened, because he would have had probably more time in the East to carry out his killing operations. And so it's kind of hard to know what would have happened in that case.
Yeah.
But one thing I think we do know for sure, and that is we know that Churchill had a much clearer understanding of Hitler than Chamberlain did. In Cooper, when he talks about sort of poo-poos the idea that Chamberlain was just this appeaser, and Churchill was sort of the heroic figure and everything. And Chamberlain, though, did not understand Hitler at all, and that's why he appeased Hitler. It's not just that Chamberlain appeased Hitler and gave him the Sudetenland and at the Munich conference and things like that. Chamberlain was naive in thinking that Hitler would keep his word. He was naive in thinking that Hitler would do what Hitler said he would do. In fact, there's this famous video clip that I have seen quite a number of times because I show it to my class. And back up. Chamberlain is holding this piece of paper when he gets back from the Munich conference. And he says, "This paper has my signature on it, and it has Herr Hitler's signature on it. And it says that we are never going to go to war with each other." And so Chamberlain thinks it's a done deal. Hitler's given his word. Hitler will keep his word. And so Chamberlain was completely naive in his read on Hitler. Churchill, on the other hand, when Chamberlain came back from the Munich conference, Churchill, a few weeks later, said this, and I'm not quoting exactly, but I'm coming very close to the direct quotation of Churchill. Churchill said to Chamberlain, "You were given a choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, and you shall have war." And so
Wow.
Churchill really understood what Hitler was about. He understood Hitler wasn't going to stop there. Chamberlain thought Hitler was going to stop with the Sudetenland. Churchill realized that wasn't the case. Chamberlain only had his eyes opened once Hitler took over Czechoslovakia. And then Chamberlain realized, we better try to solidify Poland, because we know that's going to be Hitler's next target. And it was. So they made a pact with Poland. Hitler didn't take that seriously, went ahead and attacked Poland anyway, hoping that Britain would just stay out of it. Chamberlain decided that's the last straw. And so, when people like Cooper start, criticizing Churchill for, not making a deal with Hitler, Churchill understood Hitler a lot better than Chamberlain did. And I think he understood Hitler a lot better than Cooper does. Cooper, I don't think, understands Hitler at all.
Do you think that Cooper, what category would you put him in? Would you put him in a semi-revisionism? Would you put him in a I don't know, somewhat of a revisionism or a full revisionism? I mean, it doesn't sound like he's trying to give a full revisionism, but it sounds like he's kind of giving somewhat of a different spin, which is why he placed the emphasis on we're almost like I'm paraphrasing, but like basically we're looking at this objectively now. As we further get along, we're able to look back on this objectively as if nobody has done this before. And then he's trying to recast the characters where now it's not really Hitler as the main culprit. The one who started the war is Churchill. But what category would you put Cooper's narrative of World War II in?
Well, I don't know quite exactly where to pigeonhole him in this respect. And one of the reasons why is because I'm not clear what he believes about the Holocaust. I was very disturbed by the way that he talked about Hitler, which he didn't talk about a lot, but he did mention, he said that when I'm criticizing Churchill, he said in his interview with Tucker Carlson, he said, "I'm not meaning to say that Hitler was a good guy either." But then when he criticizes Hitler, here's what he criticizes Hitler for. He said that when Hitler went to war in the East in 1941, he didn't have any plans of what to do with the POWs. He doesn't say anything about the Holocaust. Doesn't say anything about killing people with disabilities, which Hitler was doing also in 1941 already. He doesn't say anything about any of these other atrocities, and he doesn't. And then he claims that Hitler's killing of the POWs was just based on poor logistics. He has no understanding that Hitler and his generals actually talked before they invaded the Soviet Union about a hunger plan. The hunger plan was they were going to starve the populations of the Soviet Union, and so they could provide food for Germans. And so they were already planning starvation on a mass scale. with civilian populations. And so the notion of killing civilians was built into Hitler's mentality before he went into the Soviet Union. In fact, let me read to you something here that Hitler
Nice.
told his generals. He told them this just a week before he went into Poland. Here's what this is a speech to his generals. This is a private speech. This is not public. This is not something that anyone would have known about. We now know about it because we have the transcripts of it from post-war period. But no one would have known about this during the time except for the generals who he's talking to. He told them this at his own private residence. He said, he talked about the beginning of the war. And he said, this is what he said. In initiating, this is a quotation from Hitler, in initiating and conducting the war, it is not a matter of moral rightness, but rather it's a matter of victory. Close your hearts to sympathy. Proceed brutally. 80 million people, and here the 80 million people he's talking about, the Germans, the German population was 80 million at that time. 80 million people must obtain their right. Their existence must be secured. The stronger has the right. Greatest hardness. So Hitler was telling his generals, we need to be brutal in this war. Close your heart to sympathy. Don't have sympathy for these people. And so, this is the kind of thing that Cooper just glides right over and doesn't. If he's not a Holocaust denier, I don't know if he's a Holocaust denier or not, but if he's not a Holocaust denier, he's at least a Holocaust ignorer. That is, he totally sweeps it under the rug and makes it seem like that's not a big deal. And then he blasts Churchill for killing civilians, but he doesn't think about the fact that Hitler. Do you know where most civilians were killed in World War II?
No,
the Soviet Union. It wasn't in Germany. There were civilians killed in Germany, and as I already said, I don't endorse all of what the British did in terms of killing civilians in Germany, but there were far more civilians killed in the Soviet Union and in Poland than there were in Germany and in other German occupied territories too. And this was done systematically. It was not just a matter of bombing. We don't have pinpoint bombing. We're going to, or trying to soften up the population. I mean, this was targeted killing of people who were no threat to the Germans whatsoever, whom they were not at war with. So killing the Jews, for example, or people, they weren't at war with the Jews. These Jews were not a threat to them in any way, and yet they're rounding them up and killing them entirely for racial reasons. And not just the Jews. Gypsies also, the so-called Roma and Sinti, they were also rounded up and killed. People with disabilities were killed. 200,000 Germans plus tens of thousands of other non-German people with disabilities were killed over the course of World War II. These people were killed systematically. They were civilians. People with disabilities were no threat to the Nazi regime, to their war effort or anything, although Hitler claimed they're draining resources. And so, so they give a military reason for it too. But Hitler believed that even before the war began, that they should kill people with disabilities. He just didn't implement it until the war. So Hitler's killing vast numbers of civilians, far more than Churchill even dreamed of. And so to claim that, Churchill is the great villain, and by the way, Cooper uses some pretty negative terminology about Churchill. He says Churchill's a psychopath. He says that he resents Churchill at one point in the interview there. And he says Churchill is the chief villain. So he uses some very negative terminology about Churchill. He never uses that terminology about Hitler. Again, he doesn't talk extensively about Hitler. Maybe he would use more negative terminology about Hitler if he was talking more extensively about him, but he certainly uses some pretty negative terminology about Churchill. I'm not here to defend Churchill. There were things about Churchill, certainly his private life, that were not on all that great. But on the other hand, in thinking about his relationship to the war and to Hitler, it seems to me he had a much clearer vision of what was going on in Europe in the run-up to World War II than did Chamberlain, and also the people like Cooper that are trying to revise these notions also.
Well, that's just it. Where in these people, I feel like they're being very subtle, and it's for a purpose. They, again, they just want to move the pieces around just to get you to doubt and to question, and then act like that they're the ones who are being objective, and they're being brave and bold enough to tell people the truth. And like how you mentioned, he basically, Cooper in the interviews just ignores Hitler and what he did, and all the blame goes to Churchill. And he did that with these Nazi death camps. How you mentioned, oh, Hitler wasn't perfect, and then he goes into almost as if Hitler, his definition of Hitler wasn't perfect was just Hitler just kind of missing out on something, like falling short accidentally, where he didn't prep enough for the POWs, and that's why he killed them. And then he quoted this one Nazi who said, "We should basically just kill him now. Like, wouldn't that be more humane?" And then he didn't even touch on it, as if that was sufficient enough for the answer.
Yeah.
So what you're thinking, and it's very subtle and quick. Churchill was a bad guy. Yeah, Hitler wasn't perfect, and he miscalculated, but it was more humane. Killing them up front was more humane than just letting them starve and then just move on. And
And
this is the nuance that these guys are using, and they're very nuanced, and they're trying to just push an agenda. And if they can do these methods and tactics, this is how they're getting people to come on to the revisionism of World War II.
yeah. And it totally ignores some amazing things. Like, say, for example, Hitler, before the invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939, had Himmler organize Einsatzgruppen, which are commando units.
Mm,
Usually they were composed of SS units or else police units. And these Einsatzgruppen were tasked with killing civilians. They were tasked, they had
really?
61,000 names that they had on lists that these Einsatzgruppen were supposed to target. A lot of these were intellectuals, Catholic clergy. There were some prominent Jews
Wow.
also, and there were 61,000 names that were put on these lists of people that the Nazis wanted killed. These are not military targets. These are civilian targets. And these are groups, and so these Einsatzgruppen were going in behind the regular army, and they were rounding up whichever of these people they could find. They actually ended up killing about 50,000 people uh, in
Gee.
the in 1939 to 40, in going in behind the regular forces. So this is a targeted killing of civilians, and they even drew up lists of who they were going to kill. So this isn't just a random kind of thing of, oh, we mistook them for a provocateur or something like that. We're going to kill this person because they're a Catholic clergy. We think they have too much influence, or they're an intellectual, or whatever. Then when the Germans attacked the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, they likewise organized Einsatzgruppen, just like they had in Poland, although they had even more this time. And these Einsatzgruppen, which were SS units or police units, went into the Soviet Union behind the regular army, and they rounded up mainly two categories: the Jews and the commissars, that is, Communist Party officials. And they rounded them up and killed them in mass killings in the Soviet Union. These were mass shootings. A lot of people when they think about the Holocaust, they think about the gas chambers of Auschwitz, and indeed
Yeah.
there were over 1 million people killed in the gas chambers of Auschwitz, as well as other gas chambers in Treblinka and other places. But the first major onslaught of the Holocaust was by shooting squads, these Einsatzgruppen, in the Soviet Union. And they went
Mm.
in, they killed hundreds of thousands of Jews. They rounded them up. They took them outside of towns, usually, sometimes near gravel pits, or sometimes dugout places. Sometimes they had them dig their own graves, but they would have mass graves where they would kill thousands upon thousands of Jews. And so by the end of 1941, they had killed several 100,000 Jews simply by shooting squads there in the Soviet Union. So this is killing civilian people purposefully, just because of their race. They also killed communist commissars, claiming that they were the enemy, of course, because they were Communist Party officials and such. They also killed them as well. So there were lots of civilian casualties that Hitler perpetrated consciously, knowingly, on purpose. This was not just some bombing campaign on a city, killing some civilian people.
What do you how do you respond to people who do deny this? Like, because this is common as well. Where so what I see is two things happening with these revisionists. They're taking Hitler at his word, and just basically like, whatever he says in his speech, that's what they believe, whatever he writes down as far as positive Christianity goes. They're taking him at his word. They're not defining what God and what Christ he's talking about. So they're just believing him up front. And then when you quote them things like you're quoting them, they say, "Oh, that's just fake," or "That didn't happen." So how would you respond to that? And what kind of like evidence that we can give people so that they can know, no, this actually did happen. We're not making it up, and we're not, just coming out of this boomer theology where World War II is in our
Yeah.
blood and we can't question it. Because that's another, rhetoric talking point where it's like they'll call you and even me a boomer for believing this, and they'll say that we're making World War II a mythology and we just can't handle the truth, and they're the strong masculine guys who are finally going to get World War II right and save us all from this post-war consensus.
Yeah, the problem is, how to sift I mean, the evidence is so massive and overwhelming that it's uh, difficult to deny unless you have a particular reason you want to deny it. And so, for example, so when people who want to deny the Holocaust, for example, and again, I don't know if Cooper is in that camp or not, but uh, there are people like that out there. They're a fringe element, but typically they're motivated by anti-Semitism. So they have a motive that they don't want to believe any of the testimony. I mean, the testimony comes from a vast number of sources, and the sources are all over the map in terms of ethnic identity. There's Soviets, there's Germans, there's Norwegians, there's Poles, there's Czechs, there's French, there's British, there's Americans, there's people and Jews, non-Jews. It's not just like it's all Jews that are saying these things or anything. There's Jews, there's non-Jews. The evidence is all over the place, and the evidence includes the statements by the Germans themselves, evidence that from German speeches and notes and other kinds of things that we have. I mean, the evidence is just so massive that if someone wants to deny it, they really just have to decide that, I just don't believe these things because why? Well, because, oh, it's just part of this Jewish conspiracy. And so basically what you end up with is this notion and that if anyone wants to try to challenge someone who, with evidence, someone who's denying these things, they will just have a fallback position, which is, oh, everything that you're saying is just part of this Jewish conspiracy. It's
Yes.
all just part of this conspiracy. And again, Cooper calls it mythology. And again, I don't know if Cooper's
Yes.
a Holocaust denier, but he does call it this mythology that's been created. And so, basically they just sweep it away and claim that all this evidence really doesn't mean anything because
Hmm.
it's all been compiled by people who are, allegedly who are tainted in their views and different things like that. The reality is the exact opposite, really. The reality is that the views of people that are trying to revise this historiography is generally tainted by their negativity toward Jews and their sometimes positive appreciation for Hitler, although that's not always the case. Again, Cooper doesn't say he likes Hitler, but again, the things he criticizes him for are not the biggest problems with Hitler. He criticizes him for things that are rather, I would consider sort of minor compared to the major points, and totally misunderstands Hitler in the process.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Here, let's try to see if we can take some questions from the audience. So we got three so far. Anybody watching, you want to get in a question? We'll try to go through this. So here's one from Easy Rider Bob. Have you heard of Albert Pike's? I believe that's a Freemason letter to Giuseppe Manzini, circa 1880, regarding a plan for 3 world wars. Is that letter a fraud, a coincidence, or what? Thank you.
Sorry, I know nothing about that.
I know, you know what? Albert Pike is a Freemason, and he did prophesy, if I can use that word, about 3 world wars. I don't think that is a fraud letter. I think he actually really did do that. And he wrote a book, Morals and Dogmas. I believe you
Mhm.
can find it there. Now we got one from Dalton. Hey, Dalton. Which revisionist? Okay, yeah. So I kind of hinted at this. There's more than one kind of revisionist. 'Cause that's what we're talking about. World War II revisionism. There's the deniers, but they're not the only camp. Are there? So how many camps of revisionists are out there? Is there is there two? Like I said, a semi-partial and then a full partial, because that's the only categories that I know, unless I'm missing one.
Well, to be honest, I'm not quite sure how many camps there are, and most of the camps, most of my career, I've uh, studied the historiography of bona fide historians, many of them with university positions and such, who have studied very meticulously these things. And I myself have, in my own studies, where I have done research about Hitler, for example, and things like that, I have pretty much found that what they have written bears out. So it's not just like I'm just believing people, just because they say it or whatever. Uh, but there are, of course, the Holocaust deniers that I'm quite aware of, and I haven't met very many of them. I did meet one time many years ago, but I haven't really met many of them. Although I've read a number of their things and looked at it. Uh, there are, of course, people who there are people who put some quarter. There is a historian named A.J.P. Taylor who, back in the mid of the 20th century, was considered something of a revisionist, but he didn't deny the Holocaust or anything like that. But he did think that Britain should have stayed out of the war and such, and so that was a sort of a controversial point. So that's a point, the same kind of point that Cooper and others are kind of making today too. So A.J.P. Taylor he was a bona fide historian who, knew the material well, and wasn't some crank or something like that. Unfortunately, a lot of what goes by revisionism, though, especially Holocaust revisionism, a lot of it is done by people who just ignore all of the evidence that's out there. Again, because they just dismiss it as being part of a Jewish world conspiracy. Now, I'm not sure. I know there are people like A.J.P. Taylor who don't go that far. There are others who wouldn't deny all of it and such, but I'm not sure where they fall either.
Well, I would say, I think you highlighted a good point, that what Cooper's doing, if he's not denying it, he's ignoring it, and I think that's a very true trait or fruit that I'm seeing with these people who are trying to say, and just again, like move the figures around, where it's not Hitler as the worst player now, it's Churchill. And as we talk about this, and as we do this, it just never gets brought up. Like, nobody talks about the eugenics. Nobody talks about him purposely going after the Slavs, his own people, rounding the Jews up. It's just completely ignored, as if it just doesn't happen, and that's not even on the table. So I mean, it's probably safe to say that a common denominator with these people is, if there's not a denial of the Holocaust, it's really just an ignoring of it. So whether they want to be implicit or explicit, it seems to be that's the common denominator, where what we're told about World War II, specifically stuff like, again, eugenics and concentration camps, that's just really not true. We can't really trust the sources. You think that's fair and accurate?
Yeah, I didn't catch all that because we had some glitches there with my
Oh, okay.
internet. But basically, I don't have any problem with people when they criticize Churchill. And this, by the way, is another camp that I think is important one to acknowledge, and that is that there are people who criticize Churchill and the Allies for war atrocities, and I don't have any problem if people want to criticize them for bombing civilian populations. For example, in the Dresden bombing that took place in February of 1945 was largely a civilian population. There was really no military value to that target. There were lots of refugees that had fled to Dresden at the time. So I think it was a horrific act. I think the Allies shouldn't have done it. I don't have any problem with people wanting to criticize the Allies for some of the things that they did, like the Dresden bombing or other kinds of bombings of civilian targets and things like that. I think it's perfectly legitimate, and to hold Churchill accountable for some of those things. I don't have any problem with people criticizing those kinds of things. And so if that's what people are talking about, then I don't have an issue with that. But when they start then sort of comparing Churchill to Hitler and making it seem like Churchill is even worse than Hitler, that's a huge problem, because Hitler did far worse things than that, killed far more people, killed far more people purposefully, and killed them systematically in a way that Churchill didn't even come close to. So when we're thinking about church, and again, when you deal with Churchill versus Chamberlain, again, I think Churchill actually understood Hitler better than Chamberlain. Again, I'm not exonerating Churchill for everything he did, and so I don't have a problem when people want to criticize the Allies for some of their wartime activities. As far as I'm concerned, that's on the table, and I think most historians would agree with that too. I don't think most historians have a problem with that. If you're going to criticize Churchill for some of the things that the Allies did, some historians do that. There's quite a number of historians that criticize, the Dresden bombing, for example, or something like that was carried on by British and American forces. So, there's no problem with criticizing them, but when you make that sort of the focus of your entire presentation about World War II, and Hitler's atrocities get sort of pushed to the background, then I think there's a big problem with that kind of a view.
Well, and that's the thing too, people are acting as if we're unaware of these other crimes committed during World War II. I remember growing up, I was taught that Stalin did many horrible, horrible things, and I was really well aware that that there was more death tolls committed by him than any other. And so, it wasn't just, oh, only Hitler's the bad guy, and everybody else is just good. I learned about even working, camps in America with Germans and Japanese. So it wasn't this, America was just spotless. The Allies were spotless, and there was no other war crimes. And Hitler was just, the epitome of all that's evil. Like we're well aware of this, and people are are using again, this talk where there's this mythology behind it, and it's
Yeah.
kind of encompassing everybody. We're all in this bubble, and anybody who wants to be or objective to this is seen as the hero. And we're just all living in this boomer land. And I just think, well,
Yeah.
who's really living like this? Who's actually unaware of some of these things that you talk about? And that's
Yeah,
one of
and
the things I'm finding.
historians have been on the forefront of bringing out these kinds of things. I'm glad you mentioned the concentration camps in the United States. Historians have been on the forefront of bringing this to the public attention of what the United States did during World War II, and it was an injustice that was done to the Japanese Americans during that time. It's not like there's this mythology that we historians are unwilling to deal with or something like that. We're very willing to criticize people and events where that's warranted, and we do that. And so in the case of, say, the Japanese Americans, there's been a lot of historical research relating to that and showing the injustices that were done to them. The United States was not, clean in everything we did during the war either. No one's trying to make, no historian that I know of, and he was trying to make that claim there. But on the other hand, interestingly, if you think about the concentration camps with the Japanese Americans in the United States, start comparing that to Auschwitz, and you'll see very quickly
Yeah.
that what the Germans were doing was far, far more evil than what the Americans were doing to the Japanese Americans. The Japanese Americans, for the most part, as far as I know, there were none who were systematically killed. There may have been some that died of old age or other diseases or whatever in the camps, but they were not systematically shot or gassed. And the numbers of people would be much smaller too when you start thinking about the millions that were going through and dying in the Nazi death camps and such. And by the
Mhm.
way, Auschwitz is just one among several death camps. And the Nazis also, by the way, had a lot of concentration camps in addition to their death camps too. There were literally hundreds of concentration camps during World War II, including ones for forced labor. So Ukraine, France, other occupied territories, they would send people, especially young men and women, would be sent back to Germany to do work in the factories and fields because most of the German men were on the front fighting. And so there were all these forced laborers that were being sent back there, and they were often not treated all that great either. So, if you start comparing what the United States did with what Germany did, the comparison is pretty stark contrast. Again, it doesn't mean America did everything right. we should have done things differently in certain cases, certainly relating to the Japanese Americans. But it's not even close to what the Nazis were doing to their civilian populations.
I was yeah, so I was literally thinking about this today too, in regards to the American concentration camps that we had, and it was just compared to Nazi Germany. Even if these people want to say, oh well, it was just propaganda, and the Germans weren't killing Jews. So why don't we have propaganda for the Allies then? Because we had camps. Why do you find no stories like Corrie Ten Boom of horrible things that was going on in America? It's only when it comes to Nazi Germany do we? Could it be because these multiple firsthand testimonies are actually true? Because it's not just like one people, not just like some outliers over here saying this. We have tons and tons of witnesses, even from as you mentioned in your book, firsthand testimonies like Goebbels in his diary, talking about how they're going to liquefy. What is it, like 70 or 60% of the Jews? I don't know if that quote was from your book, but I recently come in
Mhm.
contact with Goebbels' diary talking about how they're literally killing Jews in these camps for the purpose of eliminating them based upon a racial category. And you never find this testimony in America. So yeah, we had camps, we were bad, but it wasn't in that sense, but not in the Hitler sense, which is much worse.
Yeah, and we have testimony not just from the Jews too. Again, a lot of people, oh, a lot of people, some people want to discount Jewish testimony because then they think it's just a, attempt to get Jewish sympathy or whatever. They're anti-Semitic themselves. We have testimony from the Germans themselves about what happened, and there are many Germans who've testified about what took place in those camps as well. There are Polish workers, non-Jews, who are in those camps often, who witnessed a lot of the things that took place, and they've testified about it. There were Soviet uh, prisoners of war who were taken. There are some who survived. Most of them didn't survive. Most of them died, but there were a few that did survive, and they've borne testimony. So there's just lots of different testimony that we have, but from all sorts of different people groups and such. Again, not just from the Jews, that testify, and they all agree with what happened in those camps. And so
Yeah.
it does seem to me that the testimony is pretty overwhelming to anyone who doesn't just want to close their eyes and ears.
Here's a question from Easy Rider Bob. Can your guest speak to the 1,000-year Reich? Seems like a messiah claim.
Yeah, it was a messianic claim. In fact, I think Hitler was very forthrightly trying to connect himself with the Messiah. In fact, it's not the only place he did that. There were quite a number of places where Hitler tried to take on the persona of the Messiah to the German people. And so, this notion that there's going to be this 1,000-year Reich, which is what Hitler was claiming or prophesying, however you want to think about it, was designed to try to uh, claim that he's bringing in the millennium. That's what 1,000-year Reich is. It's the millennium, right? So
Yeah.
the claim is that Hitler's trying to bring in the millennium and bring in, a sort of perfect, ideal society for Germans ultimately in the long run. So yeah, I think it was definitely a messianic claim. And again, it's not the only place that Hitler made messianic claims. He made a lot of messianic claims, in fact.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see the kind of same talk, going on Twitter where people are literally mentioning genocide. It's horrible. And the idea is that if we just get rid of these Jews, then we'll bring in the this golden age for humanity. And it's no surprise that Hitler thought that same thing too. And I think that's where they're all drawing from the same kind of pool that if we get rid of these certain amount of people and we're all just in this Darwinian sense, as you point out in your work, then the world will finally be rid of the so-called Zionism or Judaism, whatever kind of name they
Yeah.
want to attach to this people group. And so the idea is not to preach the gospel, just let's just get rid of them, and then it will be better because this is the
Yeah.
cause of our problems.
Yeah, and that's the irony too. And I point this out in my book, Hitler's Ethic, because Hitler thought that the Jews were biologically immoral. He thought that moral traits were biological, and that Jews had these immoral biological traits like deceitfulness, sexual promiscuity, uh, greediness. So these things that were caricatures and stereotypes of Jews, Hitler thought these were biological, and he thought that thus they were being passed on from generation to generation by the Jews, and there's nothing you can really do about it unless you get rid of the Jews themselves. So Hitler actually, and on the other hand, Hitler thought the Aryans or Nordic race were honest, had integrity, were frugal and, hardworking, and all these, and he thought the Jews were lazy. He thought the Aryans were hardworking. So he has all these positive moral traits that he thinks the Germans are emblematic of Germans. So ironically, Hitler thinks that by killing the Jews, he would make the world more moral. He thought that he could improve morality by getting rid of the Jews because he thought the Jews were immoral. So we get rid of the Jews, we get rid of immorality.
Yes, Dalton just said this. A lot of these totalitarian ideologies tend to pick up this almost post-mill view, and I do agree with you on that. And a lot of these guys nowadays are post-millennialists who are pushing this World War II, revisionism, or they hold to theonomy, where the kingdom of God is built by us by bringing in the law to the nations, and it's through politics, not through salvation. And this is how we're going to do it. So I think you're absolutely right. Are you familiar with that eschatology a little bit, or how they verse?
The post-millennialism, yeah, I do understand it. Interestingly, it's tough to know because, of course, they're not usually, like in the case of the communists, in the case of Hitler, they're not, making any kind of claims that would about how their views dovetail with, these kinds of eschatologies or anything like that. But they certainly do think that they're going to bring about a perfect society, or at least a much, much better society. They do have these utopian kind of views. And whether that's post-mill, I'm not sure. But they certainly believe that they're going to bring about a better society. So thinking about, Lenin and Stalin and stuff in the Soviet Union, they believe that by getting rid of private property, that's going to bring on a peaceful, cooperative society where everyone's going to get along. No one's going to have any problems with each other. We're all going to live in peace and prosperity, ultimately. So there is this notion of sort of bringing about this this utopia that could be considered millennial.
Yeah. Here's a really good question by Joshua Tanis. Could you talk about the anti-Christian nature of the far right? I never heard this book, like Matthew Rowe's book in your own work. Why do you think young men are attracted to these mad ethnic nationalist ideas?
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, thanks, Josh. Josh is actually a former student of mine.
Oh, really? That's awesome.
Yeah, very sharp guy.
That's awesome.
Yeah. It's hard to know what's really driving all of these things, but I mean, there's this basic sinful human nature that we all have, and pride is part of it. And I think the ethnic nationalist ideas do play on pride very strongly. That is, they try to claim that we are better than others, right? So there's this notion that it sort of caters to this pride within us. Oh, I'm better than, if I'm part of this, and it can play out a lot of different ways, by the way. It can play out, I as an American, just because I'm an American, am better than others. It can play out on a racial basis. I as a white person am better than others, or, there's all sorts of ways it can play itself out. But I think it does cater to the pride that's in a lot of people. And so I think especially with people that are having difficulty moving up and advancing and succeeding in life, there can be this sense of which this can sort of be a way of explaining why I didn't get ahead. It's because, there's all these, it's because of the diversity, equity, and inclusion things. They're giving all these things away to these people of other races and such. And I'm not promoting DEI, by the way, not far from it. But my point here is that, you can just blame other races for your inability to get ahead in life. It's all because they're being given preferences and I'm not, and so we're being discriminated against. And I think there is also a case in which DEI does actually end up discriminating in ways that people recognize as unfair and unjust, and sometimes it is unfair and unjust. In fact, I've been really astonished that a university, and I'm not going to name it here, actually advertises that they have an all-black honors college.
Hmm.
And they're proud of that, and presumably because they think it's helping blacks by segregating them. So I can see why, some people would look at that kind of thing, and there's a lot of things going on like that, would look at something like that and say, why are we segregating races? Why are we giving preference to people based on their racial type rather than, on their abilities and their talents and their work and work ethic and things like that? Why are we giving these preferences to these people just based on their racial status? And then we can add on a layer of this too, now that we have a lot of immigration issues, illegal immigration issues too. That sort of, I think, also fuels some of this as well, because the issue is, why are all these illegal immigrants able to come into the United States, but I can't get a job, or I can't get ahead, or I can't,
Yeah.
succeed in my place, and yet we're, giving all this stuff to these other people. So I think there's all sorts of subtle ways that sort of feeds into it, but I think there's also then is just this basic sinful pride that it caters to that some people are willing to latch on to.
You know what? I do remember his comment from I think it was a couple days ago in our original video saying that he was your student as well. So now it's coming back to me with that. But
The
I
other thing
think
about the
too.
other thing about that too, makes
Yeah,
one other point about that too, is that now I lost it. Sorry, forgot what I was going
that's
to say.
okay.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So what I was going to say, going off of his question, to your point, so a lot of young men and people, women too, but our younger generation has woken up to these things like DEI actually is not good. It hurts us, and so it makes us angry. Especially me, like I'm young, I'm
Hmm.
married, we have a daughter. It's financially hard for us. I live in New Jersey. Taxes are so incredibly high. The politics are awful. And so it can make you really angry. And there's a lot of prominent Christian leaders out here who are recognizing this and capitalizing on this and being shrewd and trying to lead them in a direction, not even trying, or leading them in a direction that's not good. And that's why, there's like podcasters out there that are
Yeah.
recognizing that these young men, they need someone to lead to, and unfortunately these podcasters have ill motives and they just want to lead them towards the wrong solution. So they're leading them towards revisionism, where it sounds revolutionary, it sounds cool, where now you can actually be a man
Yeah.
and be masculine, contrary to the world that tells you that you can't. And so
Yeah.
there's good intentions and desires, but just like the Nazis or the people during that time, there was hardships going on too, and unfortunately, some of them chose the Third Reich, and that was the wrong solution for them. And I
Yeah.
think we're seeing that a little bit
Right.
right now, where we can get too caught up in these things, and there's this
Mm.
overcorrection, there's this radical swing where the question everything becomes, I got to question absolutely everything, including, well, Churchill now is a bad guy, not Hitler. And it's just radical, and people are getting lost in this. Like, you can go,
Yeah.
communism is bad, but so is fascism. And unfortunately, people are making these radical turns where it's like, okay, liberalism is
Mhm.
bad, so let me just choose something like Christian nationalism or ethno nationalism now. And now
Yeah.
the Jews are responsible for everything. They're the reason why I'm not succeeding. And
Yeah.
these podcasters are capitalizing on this and leading them down a wrong direction. And it's a really, really unfortunate. Like I told you before, I never would have predicted that I would have had to talk about stuff like this, where
Yeah.
people are just revising things, and like now it's all about how we got to get rid of this conceptionist mythology of World War II, and you have to view certain things about World War II. If you don't, I'm going to call you a boomer. If I don't, I'm going to call you a liberal. And young men are dealing with these things and facing these things right
Yeah.
now. This is one of the pressing things that we really have to work through as Christians right now.
Right. I agree with you. And it dawned on me that as you're saying that too, that one of the issues that also, and it sort of gets an answer also to Josh Tannis's question too, is one of the issues that we're facing here today is that as the left becomes more radicalized, which they have, as we see the progressive left pushing further and further and further, it leads to a reaction against some of those things. And unfortunately, sometimes that reaction is an overreaction. And that's exactly what took place with the Nazis, for example. During the
Yes.
Nazi period, one of the reasons why the Nazis were able to gain so much support of the German public, and they never won a majority of support before they took power, but they did win a third of the votes in a free and fair election. One of the reasons they were able to gain so much support was because there was fear of communism. Lots of people were
Mhm.
afraid of what the communists were doing. The communists were growing at that time during the Great Depression. This is during the time of the Great Depression. So the communist was growing. The communist movement was growing. People were becoming more radicalized on the left. And so this pushed people to a further radicalization to the right. And I think that's also taking place in our society too. I think we're becoming more polarized. And I think we as Christians need to be very careful here because we need to be very careful that we're not embracing, radical, the left or the right in their political positions, but we're trying to embrace the love of Jesus for all people
Yes, amen.
and trying to apply that across the board and such, rather than trying to find ways to uh, combat the left by, sometimes overreacting.
Because I never really realized what exactly until I recently started, studying this more, what fascism was all about, and how I think, going back to, Josh Tannis's question is too with young men, they're seeing, okay, fascism is against liberalism, so am I. There's this form of Christian values. I can love my nation, love my people. It's okay for that. And I think that that's appealing for them. But then when you actually look at what fascism
Hmm.
is, just because it rejects certain things, it has some similarities. Like there's this Christianity behind it. When you discover it, when you look at its history, it's just as ugly as communism. That's why we see again like
Yeah.
eugenics, stealing land, lies. Like you told me in your one book, what is it, Darwinianism with Hitler? Like you have one chapter dedicated to Hitler just lying to the people. And so he was
Yeah.
basically just posturing himself towards them, telling them what they want to hear, telling them that this is better for you. Look at these communists. Look at what they're doing. Come choose my side. You can be a Christian. I like God too. And all that was just a lie. And you can see the fruit of what actually happened when it was, what is it, 6 to 8 million, were dead and within a 12-year period of them. And they chose that with good intentions. They wanted a better life. But unfortunately, as I keep on saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, not
Mm.
heaven. Hell is
Yeah.
paved with good intentions, and I think people need to realize this. And unfortunately, there's many lies going around, for especially with a younger generation, and then they're also being taught to disparage those above us in as far as the older crowd. We're starting to taught now, or they're being taught to not like them, and literally this term boomer, doctor, is now a derogatory term that they're capitalizing on, and it's a boogeyman to say that if you disagree with me on this revisionism of World War II,
Yeah.
you're a boomer. And this is what the young men are being taught, and it's such a tragedy. I never would have saw it coming, but as you mentioned, here we
Yeah.
are. And the focus has to be the cross of Christ and Jesus and the gospel, because otherwise we're just going to be, we're going to be lost and be
Yeah.
just repeating our past. Is there anything
Yeah.
you want to add to that, and just anything else you want to mention?
Well, I think we've managed to cover most of the territory.
Perfect. Well, sincerely, thank you for coming on and talking about this again. Buy this book I read. He has other books on Amazon. This one's in the description of this video. If you guys can please like this video, share it, and subscribe to Method Ministries if you haven't. And until next time, we'll see you around. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you, Doctor. Again, sincerely appreciate you and your work in helping us talk through these things.
Great talking to you.
All right, guys,
It's
take
great
care.
talking to
God
you.
bless us. Yeah, definitely. Take care, guys. We're signing off. God bless. At the end of stream button.